Welcome. Today we're going to take a look at plot structures. So we'll look specifically at 6 different plot structures that writers can use to tell a story. So our first plot structure we're going to look at here is the traditional plot structure. You'll see this in folk and fairy tales, such as The Three Little Pigs. This is a very simple plot structure. It starts out with exposition. And in your exposition, you have the introduction of your characters, your setting, and your conflict. And the exposition can be as short as a couple of sentences, or it can be as long as a chapter or more. After your exposition, so after you know the characters, the setting, and the conflict, then you have the rising action. So the rising action is actually a series of scenes, so it's not just going to be one, typically. So it's going to be a series of scenes where the conflict is becoming more and more complicated over time. And it's called rising action because that tension throughout the story within the conflict is rising. So this may be a series of events where in each one things are becoming more and more precarious for the protagonists, that sort of thing. And then you come to the climax. The climax can be a very brief part of the story. It can be just a couple of sentences, or it can be more in-depth. And in the climax, this is the breaking point of where your conflict, that tension has broken, and you have a major shift within the story, typically a shift towards some form of resolution. After that, you have the falling action. So the falling action is where you have things are returning to normal, the previous normal, or they're returning to a new normal. So things are going to be different for the characters going forward now that they've gone through this experience. Your falling action can be a very brief part of the story. It doesn't necessarily need to be multiple chapters. Typically, your rising action is going to be the longest portion of your story. So falling action is fairly short, and then you have after that your conclusion. The conclusion is your happily ever after. This is what happens after your story, that kind of prediction of the future. And the conclusion can be as short as a sentence or two, or it can be as long as a couple of chapters. So this is your traditional plot structure. You're going to see this in stories like Three Little Pigs. Okay, another plot structure that you're going to see is the character-focused storyline. So in this, you're actually spending the majority of the time in your story focused in on the character. You have 3 things that are happening here. Your character, all the information about your character, you're putting your character into situations, and your character has a problem. But the majority of the story is about your character in their situation with their problem, and it's going to get solved at the end, yes. But really you're focused in hard on who this character is, what kind of person that they are, and you're showing that through their action, through their behaviors. So first you want to introduce that character with lots of details that the reader can relate to. Even if they don't necessarily personally identify with your character, you want them to be able to understand that character. You also want to tell your reader the situation that that character is in and give it lots of good detail. And then your character is going to have a problem to face. And as we know, when in the story of Cinderella, the majority of that story is all about her problem, right? You go through the very beginning of the story until probably 95% of the way through, she's in that problem of being in that situation of poverty and not being able to speak up for herself and being taken advantage of. So that's the vast majority of that story. It's just at the very little end there where her problem is finally solved. So Cinderella is a good example of the character-focused storyline. Another plot structure that you can use is the conflict-driven storyline. So in this one, you're going to have a lot of conflict. The conflict is going to be a larger focus, even though, of course, your characters are going to be important here. But really what you're looking for is the setup, response, attack, and resolution. So with your setup, this is where you're introducing your character, the situation that they're in, and what's going on. You're going to introduce your conflict pretty quick there at the beginning of the story. Because that's going to be very important to this kind of story. Rather than you revealing character repeatedly throughout the story. What you're really focused in here is on that action, on that conflict, on the problems. The character needs to have a strong response, typically, to the situation, to the problem, and the character will be under attack in some form, maybe challenged up against a problem or overwhelmed. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical attack. It could be a mental or emotional attack or a threat. But your character does need to be within that conflict for it to fit this type of plot structure. And then finally, you'll explain how the story plays out and is resolved over time. An example of this is Mulan. The Disney version of Mulan is what I'm thinking of here, where the majority of the story is really wrapped up into the conflict and also the variety of conflicts, because there's more than just one conflict in Mulan that she's involved in her story. Another plot structure, and this one's very well known, as your hero's journey. So this was discovered and talked about by Joseph Campbell, a wonderful academic in the mid-late 20th century. Wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. If you want to look more into this, I would definitely recommend it. So the hero's journey goes through this series of events. Your statement of the status quo, call to adventure, character's response, trial and error, point of no return, setbacks, acceptance of their situation, the final test, and the resolution. The character, also your hero, will return typically back to their original place, and they'll bring something back. They'll bring something back to hopefully improve that original place. Some examples of how this lays out is a book like The Hobbit by Tolkien, The Hunger Games. There are 4 books in that series, and absolutely everything the Marvels ever created. It's all really closely aligned with the hero's journey. Star Wars is another example. Star Wars is actually very specifically designed on the hero's journey. George Lucas was a student of Joseph Campbell, learned about the hero's journey, and then wrote Star Wars so that it would match the hero's journey. So we've got a great example of the hero's journey there. Stream of consciousness. So this is an interesting one. This is where a writer just kind of sits down and goes for it. So in this idea of stream of consciousness, the writer is going to share a lot of thoughts and feelings, connections, and events in this uninterrupted flow. Oftentimes with stream of consciousness, this is an internal story. So it's not necessarily about the external story about like what's happening with the clothes the person is wearing and what they're doing with their hands and things like this. This is not necessarily about action. It's oftentimes about their thoughts and about their emotions, about that internal complications that happen with the character. This style tends to include significant description and or dialogue. So you might see that in the stream of consciousness type of story. And an example of this is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Ulysses is another example of this style of writing. All right, we have our final one, the focus story. Focus stories are typically pretty small. This is a story that's focused in on one element of the larger story. So a focus story can be focused in on a setting, character, relationship between characters and events, a presentation of idea. It can be anything. I read a story recently where the whole story was all about one object. It was just about the mailbox. And this person had this kind of old, end of the road farm mailbox, this great big metal mailbox, and the story went for several pages just talking about this mailbox, and it was pretty interesting because you got to look at this object really close. So rather than the story presenting a whole series of events, a writer can just focus in on one little thing. If you've read anything by Tolkien, he's got a lot of side stories in his novels. These would be examples of the focus story. If you have a story that's inside of a story, which is something that absolutely happens, this is a focus story of where you may have that larger story and then you have the smaller one that's inside of that. But that smaller one is giving a lot of depth and detail on something that is within that. So these are 6 different types of plot structures, and hopefully these will be helpful to you with your writing as you move forward. Good luck with your writing.